Hi, this is Neil from Growlies, introducing the Growlies Talks with Dr. Ian Billinghurst. And Dr. Billinghurst, one of my personal heroes, one of the people I consider the father of fresh foods, has joined us today for an interview just covering some topics and his latest book, Pointing the Bone at Cancer, in dogs, cats, and humans. So I'm pretty much covering the spectrum of all mammals, I think. And then today, I just want to say thank you very much graciously joining us, Dr. B. It's very kind of you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm looking at your background. That looks very nice where you're seated right now.
It's my backyard.
Very good.
Well, we're blessed on the west coast of Canada with an abundance of green.
Well, I'm looking out now and I'm looking at what should be green, but it's covered in frost.
Oh, right. Of course, it's winter in your time.
Exactly
right.
Other
side of the world.
Yes.
So you started as an agronomist and nutritionist, and then
yes, that's correct. That's about 6 lifetimes ago.
Absolutely. It seems it was back in the 60s, right?
Correct. Yes.
So a nutritionist, I assume that was large animal nutrition?
Exactly right, yes, production animals.
Right.
Including poultry, beef, pigs, sheep, all that.
Yeah, all the big farm animals. And then agronomist is how to make best use of your crops. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's about growing crops. I found it totally boring, but for some reason I did it.
And then you taught for a while.
4 years as a high school teacher.
Oh, I didn't know it was high school.
Pure torture.
So what grade did you teach?
Oh, well, all the way through from the junior grades through to the senior grades. And I was very jealous of the senior grades heading out to do things like veterinary science and medicine.
Right. And then you became a veterinarian and veterinary surgeon at the same time, or were those two separate things?
No, they're both the same thing. They're both the same degree.
Okay. And then after that, sometime in the 80s, I believe, you branched out, I think, well ahead of your time into traditional Chinese herbal medicine.
Yes, I spent 4 years playing with that and passed all the exams, was supposed to be heading off to China to do the final practical work. And at the time I was building a veterinary hospital and the interest rates had gone through the roof. I couldn't employ staff for the cost, had to work full-time myself. And so at that point, I abandoned, I never finished that acupuncture or traditional Chinese medicine because I didn't do the practical in right. China. But I went on to use it, of course, widely in my practice. And it's really underpinned much of my thinking and philosophy from that time forward.
Yeah, a more natural approach. Certainly, the acupuncture is huge here on the west coast of Canada.
Yeah, these days I'm very kind to my patients. I use laser acupuncture, and that includes myself.
Oh, and we have a veterinarian who comes to our home who also practices laser acupuncture.
And it was really exciting in the early days because I also used electroacupuncture and used electroanalgesia and did quite a bit of or many surgeries under that with very old and failing animals, and it was absolutely brilliant. The machine broke down. I went to the bush and never returned to it, but I've still got the notes, and it was a brilliant form of anesthesia. Loved it.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Just very time consuming.
Right. And so then in the 80s, you came up with your first book, the Give Your Dog a Bone.
Let me think. That was published in 1993. Oh,
okay.
I probably spent most of the 80s trying to write it, and I kept writing these enormously long introductions. And one of my clients was a writer and publisher. He said, "Ian, you actually have to set out a list of your chapter headings and just make the introduction a bit briefer." Anyway, he set me on the path to writing.
Well, that's actually really good advice, coming up with the chapter headings ahead of time. It keeps you on task.
Yes, and that's kind of the way I did it. At least it got me going out of the introduction.
That's a good, well, you know, that book changed the world for many people.
Yeah, and it changed the world for me, because what I wanted to do was write the book so that people would, because I was answering a lot of questions just in my own practice, and really I thought, what I want to do is write this book so I never have to deal with this again. Didn't work.
Not at all. Not even a tiny bit.
Not even a tiny bit.
And then second was the barf diet.
Yeah, well, look, it's still, Give Dog a Bone is still the most popular. The barf diet I kind of wrote because a lot of Americans in particular found Give Your Dog a Bone too full of principles and not prescriptive enough. And so I thought, oh, well, I better write something just for the Americans. And so I did.
Well, that answers why one is this thick and one is this thick.
Correct.
Much more accessible, much more accessible.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah, and then now most recently, and this was published very recently, is this tome.
That's pretty thick.
This is an exceptional book, sir.
It's a totally different vein to the others in many ways.
Well, it's certainly a different topic. It broaches on the other topics, but it's an in-depth look to the history and the story of cancer in mammals.
Correct.
And so much more.
Yeah, I think it's fairly unique. We all write, as writers, I think we write books that we would like to have read. And I couldn't find every book I've written is something that I hadn't been able to find anywhere. So, damn it, I better write the damn thing.
Well, I have to say it's an exceptional tome, and we do have 2 copies signed. You were kind enough to sign them for us to give away for this event for when this all drops at the end of November.
Okay.
Yeah, and so
just getting close to Christmas.
That's correct. Yeah, and we're doing that just because of timing of getting all the interviews done that we want to get done. And
very good.
And so a couple things. So you, like myself, you end up on social media and...
Excuse me, Microsoft Word app needs your attention.
Oh, dear. That's just my computer talking to me.
That's handy.
Ignore her. Sorry.
Yeah, okay. She came through loud and clear, though. So you end up in a lot of groups like I do where we end up talking about fresh foods for pets. And I want to cover some of I call them memes, where these ideas have gone through the community and they're kind of stuck in the community. And they don't necessarily make sense sometimes. And sometimes they're bang on correct, and sometimes they're just wrong. But people still parrot them because they've heard them and they trust in the community that they've heard them from. And so, you see them all the time. Do any of those come to mind for you?
Actually, let me just say one thing. When I first graduated as a veterinary surgeon, it was in a very old building, and I was reasonably young, and the wall, we actually owned the building, so I could write on the walls, and they were old fibro walls. It was a terrible old building. Anyway, I used to write on the walls, and one of the things I wrote up there was, the only rule in life is that there are no rules. And so that's very much part of what I am. And I noticed that everybody out there has these rules. And my idea is that we should have principles, because I think I wrote down today there's something like rules are for fools. But not that I'm really having a go at people, but it was just because it rhymed, I think. I was a fan of some sorts of poetry. Anyway, but basically, if we understand principles, then we can break rules, and this is important. And so I've always been about principles, and particularly when it comes to feeding. There are certain principles, but we can ignore most of the rules. And I guess, and I still don't know what they are. There's 80-10-10 rules for how you put together
That's a funny one. That's a funny one. I need a biologist. Did you get your degree in biology when you wrote this book?
I just had a degree in ag science and vet science when I wrote, yeah.
Okay, but I would like a biologist to draw a picture of a rabbit that's 80% meat, 10% bone, and 10% organ. That would be one misfit of a rabbit.
Yeah, but that is not even true, because in the evolutionary history of the dog, we've got two species, maybe three, that we're particularly interested in: man, dog, and cat.
Yep.
Obviously there are others, but just looking at those, each of these evolved in a different way. So the cat evolved to become an obligate carnivore. The dog evolved, it is not an obligate carnivore in terms of nutrition.
We call them facultative carnivore.
Yeah, or I just sometimes refer to them as a carnivorous omnivore or an omnivorous carnivore.
Or I've also heard them called a scavenging carnivore.
Well, now this is the point. The dog evolved from the wolf, but the dog's genome is not precisely the same as the wolf, and its nutritional requirements are different because it evolved on from the wolf. And that evolution continues today. And a lot of people think, the dog stopped evolving some time ago. It's got the same genes as the wolf and all that stuff, but that's not true. And the wolf today is not our dog's ancestor, so it's evolved on too. We both came from a common wolf ancestor, and it probably started about 400,000 years ago, maybe 200, it's hard to say, when wolves, and the mitochondrial evidence for this is now coming through, that a certain group of wolves moved away from their general group and started following humans. And the genetic difference was their flight distance. They had a shorter flight distance. And so they tolerated humans, they followed them around, they scavenged from their hunting exploits. And this wasn't bad. And they also started to set up, humans didn't mind them because being what they would be an early warning signal of something approaching. And so we had the very beginnings, the faint beginnings of dog and man's association as wolf. But David Coppinger? Coppinger, anyway, he wrote a book called Dogs, a very telling title. You can guess what it's about. And he said that about 15,000 years ago, when man started or stopped hunting and started to settle down, he built communities, and outside each community there was a rubbish heap. And those same wolves with the short flight distance now began to stay there. And the shortest flight distance, of course, stayed and bred on the heap. Now, those dogs were evolving, those wolves were evolving into the dog. And we know now from Russian experiments with silver foxes, which are closely enough related to the dog to allow that relevance to be made. When you select for mental traits, you are also selecting for physical traits.
Now, they were amazed by that too. They were surprised by that outcome.
Absolutely, they were. When they buggered up their pelt breeding program, when they got instead of silver pelts, they got black and white ones, and that was, I'm sure that wasn't what they wanted.
That was not the goal. It was not the goal.
Putting that aside, this period where mankind was settling down and forming rubbish, where the wolves started to evolve into dogs, they changed their eating habits. They became more coprophagic. They became more scavenging. They became a little bit more vegetable eating, omnivorous, because there would have been the ruminal contents of the newly domesticated cattle and sheep out there, and obviously bones and all sorts of things. They became much more scavenging because there would have been a lot more bones out there. So what I'm kind of getting to in a very roundabout way is that if we look at a cat, which has evolved as a obligate carnivore, it eats whole animals.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is some ratio that you could probably come up with, maybe if you wanted to, which might approximate that low level of bone. But when you look at the dog, it's evolved as a scavenger. And in this situation, it actually evolved to require a lot more bones, and probably has for a long time before that anyway, particularly the youngsters. And if you think about how the youngsters grow, and I wrote about this in Give Your Dog a Bone actually, they're going to be last into the feast. The older dogs will eat the best muscle meat and whatever organ meat they want. The younger dogs will be left with a lot of scraps and a lot of bones. And I figured that's why dogs love bones so much. And I just, actually, in many ways, Give Your Dog a Bone was based on my experience, my observation, and in many ways, it was a scientific tome in that it was a hypothesis that I put forward based on my experience and my observations, put it out there. Now, I didn't think of it in that way at that time. I just wanted to write this stuff down and get it off my mind and not have to talk about it anymore. However, that didn't work, as we mentioned. But what actually was happening, it went out there as a broadly based hypothesis about feeding dogs. And the results have come back in spades in terms of epidemiology. Now, our wonderful scientific brethren, a lot of vets, give it a very pejorative term, which is anecdotal.
Mm-hmm.
Now, anecdotal refers to one or two cases. But when you have a whole population of animals being faced with one particular environment, in this case, a raw food diet based on evolutionary principles, we are looking at epidemiological evidence, and it's out there in spades that the dogs that eat this way do not require the vet as often, they live longer, they have fewer disease problems, etc., etc. And anyway, but that's sort of getting around to, we were talking about this 80-10-10 ratio. It doesn't apply to dogs. If there is such a thing, or something that comes close to that, it applies to cats who are obligate carnivores. We have to think of dogs in a different way. But that just brings us back to principles.
Yeah, and I think during the talk that you had given when I saw you up here in Canada and Saskatchewan last fall, you had talked about how the differences in let's say the industrialized pet food or commercial pet food industry and the fresh feeding communities. You were talking about the fine razor's edge of nutrition that the commercial guys have to feed or have to ride because of their approach to a single point of nutrition, as opposed to the broad road that a fresh feeder can. Can you talk to that for me?
Yeah, absolutely. When you feed real food, well, let's go back a fraction. What we're talking about is two very different paradigms. One is a paradigm based on feeding nutrients. The other is a paradigm based on feeding food. Now, when you feed food, it's a totally different thing to selecting out or going through a process where you decide what nutrients are present in food, what nutrients an animal requires, how much it requires, what will happen if it doesn't have the right ones. Now, that is what we have done, and that's the nutritional or the nutritionist's approach to nutrition. The evolutionary nutritionist approach to nutrition is to say, well, yes, they need nutrients, but I will never, by my research, find out which nutrients they need exactly how much they need, etc., etc. This is virtually unknowable in nutrition.
Well,
we know a lot, but we don't know. And we've got NRC and AVCO coming up with rules, and I think it's FEDIAF or something in Europe. Mm-hmm. They come up with rules, but it's all based on supplying nutrients. And the reason they need to supply nutrients is because they want to supply food or a material, it's hardly food, which is based on biologically inappropriate materials. Foods that animal did not evolve to require or evolve eating. Animals evolved eating food. In that food, there are nutrients, and this is what shapes the animal's genome. The form of the food, which is raw and, whole, and the form of that food and the fact that it contains, if you feed the broad balance of the food that animal evolved eating, you're going to supply every nutrient it requires and in the form it requires. And this works together with the homeostatic mechanisms of the animal in question, because this is what has been honed between the food and the genome over millions of years of evolution. You cannot duplicate that relationship by simply saying, compiling a list of foods that your science has decided a list of nutrients that science has deemed as necessary, trying to figure out how much of each of those, how they interact with each other. But you can't, because what you do is you put all these together and you mix them together and you cook them. And suddenly you've got masses of chemical interactions and you're producing material that this genome has never come across before. Now, when you feed that way, obtaining balance is on a knife edge. It's very, very critical. Whereas when you feed real food, the balance is broad like a road. Mm-hmm. It's really very simple. And this is one of the things I say. Nutrition is absurdly simple if you follow evolutionary rules. If you follow the modern nutritionist approach, it's beyond complicated. Mm-hmm. If you try and understand evolutionary nutrition, it's beyond complicated. It's beyond that raised to the power of infinity, because the cybernetics of the relationship between genes and food and what we currently call nutrigenomics and epigenetics, mm-hmm. that is beyond our understanding. There is no computer that can deal with it, and yet it just happens. And it's there, and we can use it, excuse me, without understanding it. No. I mean, that's a long-winded way of saying we just don't have to understand nutrition. We just have to know the foods that animals are supposed to eat, and in roughly the same proportions.
The thing that comes to mind for me, is that in human foods, every 3 years they decide eggs are either bad for you or good for you, because they're still learning so much, but they apparently have the dog and the cat down. Apparently. We're still learning, but dogs and cats, we totally got that. And I don't believe them. I stopped taking advice from Nestle nutritionally many years ago.
Well, the fundamentally most wicked, bad, awful, terrible, destructive thing they do is source of energy.
Carbohydrates.
Because not one of the species that we feed commercially, whether it's humans, dogs or cats, evolved eating this high starch, basically high sugar diet. We did not evolve on that. And the metabolic problems that brings are atrocious. Problem is, we have some very resilient genomes in all three species that do not show problems until later in life. And then they're horrendous problems.
That's where that epigenetics comes in. Your environment affecting your genes.
Well, yes, but the environment of carbohydrates as the major energy source just absolutely destroys us, and and a lot of it is through the mitochondria, as we're now discovering.
And is that ultimately the goal of pointing the bone at cancer, is showing that the root of what we're seeing today in 50% of dogs getting cancer, the more dogs die of cancer, and this, I don't know that this is fact, but Rodney Habib has said he's seen the study that says more dogs die of cancer than every other mammal on the planet.
I suspect that's probably true. And the most problematic one is the golden retriever, because of who they used as sire, some show winner some time back who absolutely had a lot of predisposing genes. But the point of pointing the bone at cancer is that our understanding of cancer itself at the moment is profoundly wrong. Mm. That's really my point. And that being the case, it explains exactly why we are failing to do anything worthwhile for people with metastatic cancer.
Because it's essentially a nutritional disease.
Absolutely. Well, it's a disease of failing mitochondria. Mm-hmm. Just very briefly, oh gosh, where do you start with mitochondria?
Well, you gave a lovely history of mitochondria in the book, and yes, and and there's many other mitochondrial diseases besides cancer, like MS comes to mind.
What they're finding is that all the mitochondrial diseases tend to occur later in life.
Mm-hmm.
And they affect the major organs. What is being realised is that those specific mitochondrial diseases, which are due to genetic problems with the mitochondria, are mimicking or showing us the way to all the degenerative diseases, which are actually due to failing mitochondria. Now, in the case of cancer and the other degenerative diseases, actually go in two opposite directions in a way. It's quite strange. Oh gosh, how do we explain this? In a degenerative disease like kidney failure, the mitochondria in the cells fail for a variety of reasons, but the cells die.
Mm-hmm.
And so as more and more cells within the organ die, it becomes less and less able to perform its functions to the level required by the organism. And so we get things like kidney failure,
Right.
because of a loss of cells. On the other hand, cancer is a situation where, because the damage is very slow and very chronic, I didn't mention in the degenerative disease, the cells are dying because the mitochondria are being destroyed by the environment, food, mainly by reactive oxygen species, again produced by high carbohydrate diets. All right, but so in all degenerative diseases, we're getting destruction of mitochondria. In most of the degenerative diseases where you get organ failure, the cell commits suicide.
Right. Right. And it's actually programmed to do so.
Exactly right. But in the case of cancer, yes, we get this failing mitochondria, and Warburg showed this back in the late 20s, 30s, and through to the 50s. He showed that if the damage to the mitochondria is slow enough, and the organism, or the cell, and this only happens in tissue stem cells, if the tissue stem cells can gradually turn on an alternative energy supply, and this is all about energy. So in degenerative disease like kidney failure, the loss of energy, the cell dies, commits suicide, apoptosis. There's another way of saying that. In the case of cancer, it doesn't die because the cell's energy supply is, or there's a resurrection process. It turns on glycolysis or fermentation. And over many generations of these stem cells, the process of glycolysis is gradually increased to the point where it can take over from oxidative phosphorylation, which is the process of energy production within the mitochondria. Mitochondria now have turned that off, but that brings with it a process of constant reproduction. And this is the basis of cancer. It's a destruction through lifestyle of the mitochondria and tissue stem cells that brings with it this alternative energy supply, and that brings with it a very ancient program. And we still see this program today. It's in early embryonic stem cells because they use glycolysis to produce the energy. And glycolysis becomes a signal to turn on ceaseless reproduction.
And it has a role during the creation of the animal, but then it turns off later, and it goes wrong later in life after the mitochondria has been harmed by environmental.
Yes. But harmed very slowly over many years. That's why cancer takes so long to develop. Now, in that process, it turns off some it turns off some growth suppressor genes. Now, we call them tumor suppressor genes, but they're actually growth suppressor genes. They're not there, well, I'm going to say they're not there to stop tumors, but I suppose in a sense they are. But they're growth suppressor genes. One of them in particular, retinoblastoma, when it is turned off, this also turns, no, it doesn't. What this does, it stops the cell from being able to use its DNA repair processes. because it doesn't halt the speed of the cell's growth. There is no time for those DNA repair process to happen. Mm. And this is where mutations come in. Now, currently, our researchers looked at a cancer cell, seen all those mutations, and said, oops, clearly they are the origin of cancer. But they are a downstream effect. So that attacking the mutations, yes, the mutations do help progress cancer forward, but they are not the cause. So when you attack them, you are not.
The cancer's already started. It's already there.
And this point, and this actually came to me as a realization, I suppose, about 4 years ago, following the work of Seafried, because I couldn't figure it out either. None of it made sense. It just didn't make sense, because the statistics that were put out by the statisticians and mathematicians who knew this stuff said that even with all these carcinogens, you could not possibly get all those mutations in specific cells to cause cancer. It's just not possible. Sorry, in specific genes. Mm. And it still is impossible. What's happening is that the mutations occur later. And unfortunately, yes, some of those mutations you can attack the results of them, and you get some benefit for a short period of time for some cancer users. And these are the so-called smart drugs, the targeted therapies. And the best of these is immunotherapies. But for the vast majority of cancers, this is not the answer. The answer is much simpler. And one of the points I make is that cancer has to be regarded not as a multitude of diseases we currently do, but as one disease of mitochondrial failure. Now, I'm not the first to say that, but what I've tried to do in Pointing the Bone at Cancer is show the science behind it and show the evolution of our cells from bacteria and archaea, and how the bacteria, the protea, that ancient bacteria that was a parasite, an intracellular parasite, came to be the mitochondria, and how that has worked to produce the modern cell with this failing, because the mitochondria have a bacterial genome, and the bacterial genome is highly susceptible to being affected by all the usual carcinogens, including all the lifestyle factors. And this is where the carcinogens act. The nuclear genome is so highly protected that there is no possible way those carcinogens could do all that damage. The damage occurs at the mitochondrial level. Excuse me.
And so people will ask us to dial it back a little, because we're talking at a very high level, or maybe even the microscopic level of what's going on, rather than the macro level of how can I make changes in my and my pet's life, right? And so,
okay. Yep, that's the most important question. And the thing is this: the reason I wrote all that microscopic detail is for the cancer professionals, for the vets, to look at this and say, hey, this is the science behind cancer. It's out there. I didn't make it up. It's all peer-reviewed stuff. I just put it together in a book and said, look at this, for goodness sake. Because unless we change what we do, we will never defeat this disease. And that's the way it's going. We haven't defeated it. We've spent billions and billions since the 70s, since Nixon began this war. And we are not defeated. The people with metastatic cancer are dying exactly the same rate, and under probably, in many cases, even more horrifying circumstances than they were in the 50s, except that we do have some drugs for palliative care that are probably better.
And anyway, millions of papers on cancer that have been paid for by the war on cancer.
Absolutely. The careers of thousands of scientists have been launched, and my molecular biology, the companies and all that, we know so much more about molecular biology, and all these companies that have got one gene that they now own, for goodness sake, that they can make a drug using the knowledge based around that gene, all this stuff. But none of this has benefited the cancer patient. So my aim with this book is to say, for goodness sake, look at the true science behind cancer, and on that basis, change what we regard as the most fundamental and important modality in its treatment. Mm-hmm. Use whatever else you want to, if you like, because this treatment actually modifies the bad effects of chemo and radiotherapy anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But attack the fundamental cause, which is the fermentation process. Cells that are cancerous have to use fermentation to produce their energy. That is where we need to attack them, starve them, and we can do it. And it's happening. But
is that the glycogenesis?
Sorry?
Is that, I apologize if I got it wrong, but is that the glycogenesis, or is that where they just get the blood supply?
Oh, you're thinking of angiogenesis.
Oh, that's what okay.
Yes. Glycolysis is the fermentation. So
that's okay. There we go. I combined the two.
There's two methods of producing. Oh, by the way, I hated this when I was at uni. It was terrible. Biochemistry was my worst subject, and it's now the one subject I realise is the most important of all. But it was presented to us so badly that we had no understanding, or I didn't anyway, of what it was all about. So I learnt stuff by rote, got through it and passed exams. Now I know. And I didn't understand back then oxidative phosphorylation and glycolysis and where they fitted in. I learned it, but I thought, I don't even know where this happens exactly. Anyway, the oxidative phosphorylation occurs in the mitochondria. From one molecule of glucose, this method produces around about 36 packets of energy called ATP. From glycolysis, it's only 2. So glycolysis is very inefficient, and this too has its impacts on the body when cancer uses glycolysis. It uses a very inefficient method to produce energy. Therefore, it is a major cause of cancer cachexia because it only burns glucose, and what it does, it can't burn fat.
And that's that wasting. That's that muscle wasting that happens to people.
Because because it burns glucose so inefficiently, it uses up all the glucose we feed it. And by the way, our oncologists stress that the people have to eat glucose, my God. But then because the cancer gobbles that up very inefficiently, apart from a thing called the Cori cycle where it recycles it and makes more glucose even more inefficiently, it also turns the body's protein into glucose. So this glucose gobbling machine is pulling out the glucose from our body, from all our organs, from our muscles. And this is this cachexia you see of people who have got cancer, because the cancer is literally eating them alive by pulling out all the protein. And they die of organ failure and malnutrition. And in fact, because so many of them die of organ failure, that's often stated as the cause of death when it was actually cancer. And so the statistics for cancer are unreported, are underreported. But anyway, that's just by the by. But what our oncologists never tell their patients is this cancer is feeding on sugar and it's dead. And in Australia, there's a very high carbohydrate food, and I better not mention the name, but all the oncologists recommend it to, in quotes, build you up. And sure, in probably for a week they feel better eating this stuff because it gives them all this sugar and energy. But in the meantime, it's also building up these growths inside them. And the oncologists just accept that as the normal pattern. If somebody goes on a ketogenic diet, and you have to be very disciplined to do that, and I haven't explained about ketosis just at the moment, but if they do that, they don't gain a lot of weight, but suddenly they're not feeding this cancer. And go back to the oncologist, they do the scans, and the metastatic cancer is disappearing. The oncologist said, oh, well, that's interesting. I don't know why that's happening, but you better do whatever you're doing. No, I don't want to know what you're doing.
That seems like a strange approach.
That's a very unscientific approach, because our oncologists are taught that this is just another alternative method of treating cancer, and alternative methods of treating cancer are forbidden.
Well, that's where they're essentially demeaning what they weren't taught by saying, well, that's alternative medicine. And you know what happens when alternative medicine works? It's called medicine. And so, you know, so they can demean it without demeaning it, you know?
Or they just say, oh, there's been a spontaneous cure, as if the fairies at the bottom of the garden had done something. But again, they will do anything not to recognise that something is working.
And we're talking about the sudden onset cancers, the ones that come up from environment. We're not talking about the genetic predisposed cancers or the cancers in young animals that were essentially in their genome at birth. Like, for instance, bear with me for just a sec. Humor me for just a sec, because you know so much more on this, and I'm just trying to wrap my head around it. So when a puppy is born, the egg that puppy came out of its mother's ovum, right? But that ovum was formed in the grandmother. So the environment of the grandmother affected the mother, which affected the puppy. You see, you're talking about, what I'm saying is the environment matters for generations. It's not just, you know, his mother was raw fed, so he's good, but the grandmother should be raw fed as well, if we're talking about dogs or cats. For the potential for, let's say in Goldens, for instance, that predisposition towards cancer at puppyhood even to come up. When we're talking about this kind of cancer, we're talking about the stuff that's happening later, mid to later in life, that's ultimately caused by, they got through all the puppy disease potential for cancer, and this is stuff that came through because of environment.
Okay.
I've given you a lot there. Sorry.
That's all right. No. That's okay. I guess there are purely genetic causes of cancer, and actually one of them is retinoblastoma, which is a cancer in the eye.
Okay.
And that is caused by a loss of the tumor or the growth suppressor gene, retinoblastoma. So, but what we now know is that even these inherited cancers still work through the mitochondria.
Right.
They because the genes of the mitochondria, the mitochondria, the way it works in company with the nucleus. I have trouble getting my head around this too. So I've got to push this through slowly. The mitochondria working with the nucleus. If there is this for example, this retinoblastoma gene that is missing, this sends certain signals to the mitochondria, and those signals are signals of increased growth. And the other thing I haven't mentioned is that the mitochondria are actually in control of whether a cell loses its differentiation, if it's a liver cell, stops being a liver cell and just becomes a cancer cell. The mitochondria are in charge of that. But they are there's a constant feedback between the mitochondria and the nucleus. And so this lack of this retinoblastoma gene actually is a signal for the mitochondria to start telling the nucleus how to behave in terms of reproduction. But what we also know is that if we could take those children and put them on a ketogenic diet for much of their lives, we actually stop a lot of the bone cancers and other cancers that form later on down the track, because a lot of these children, they become blinded by this cancer and they have to have their eyes removed, but this gene is also causing cancers elsewhere. If we can put those children on a ketogenic diet, they will live longer, particularly even if we don't start till they're adults. So even where there's a genetic deep predisposition, it's actually working through the mitochondria. Now, Seyfried, who wrote the metabolic theory of cancer, or what do you call it? Cancers and whatever he called it, I can't remember. He's the man who's really woken the world up to all of this. And he shows the evidence for this, that even these so-called inherited cancers work through the mitochondria. And so we can still deal with them on the basis that it's a mitochondrial disease. Now, sure, these people have a much greater predisposition to it, and they're in much greater danger. But this is still the way to deal with it, because ultimately most of those people with this genetically inherited predisposition are going to die, and much earlier than usual. So what we're trying to do with this is prolong their lives, and not only prolong their lives, but prolong their life with a quality of life.
That's the key.
That's right, because once we start treating cancer as a metabolic disease and we start saying, well, okay, we can deal with cancer on this level, on a nutrient level with ketones, we then start to say, well, there's a lot of other things we can do in terms of phytonutrients and minerals and all sorts of things that all retard the cancerous process. The whole point of my book was that whatever else you do, and there's lots of things that people do, they use herbs, they use homeopathy, acupuncture, all sorts of phytonutrients, etc., minerals, whatever. All of these, and we know how a lot of these things work because they attack specific areas of the cancerous process. Use all of those, but make sure you attack the fermentative process or attack cancer on that basis. Because, and even if you use, as I've said, radiotherapy or chemotherapy, the damaging effects of those are ameliorated. They're made much less when you're on a ketogenic diet. So this is my point, but I wanted to show the science behind all that.
And I wanted to make the point for people listening. And when we talk about a ketogenic diet, a lot of people think that when you talk about a ketogenic diet, you're talking about ketoacidosis that diabetics get, rather than a healthy ketogenic response from a low carbohydrate diet. Those are two different things.
Two absolutely different things. You cannot develop ketoacidosis if you have a normal level of insulin being produced. It just cannot happen. That's physiologically the facts. And in fact, where ketoacidosis might be anywhere between 10, I just forget the units, nanomoles or something, but per litre. But you might get 10 of those in somebody with ketoacidosis, all the way up to a 50 or 100, in which case they're probably dead from acidosis at that point. When you're on a ketogenic diet, you struggle to get above 2 or 3. It is very difficult. You've got to be very disciplined. And this is the point too. There are a lot of people who want to use this, but if their family in any way is against it or won't join in or doesn't understand, it's not going to work. And sadly, I see this in friends that I know. The person with cancer, he wants to do it. He doesn't quite understand it. The family doesn't understand it at all, while one person does. And so it's very difficult for people under these circumstances to use it. That is why, unless it becomes mainstream medicine, and because this is the other factor, once the doctor says you have to do this, the whole family will join in. They won't care if they don't understand it.
Yeah.
If the doctor or the oncologist prescribes that diet, which is high in fat, very moderate for protein, and as zero or as close to zero as possible with non-fiber carbohydrates, so all the soluble carbohydrates are reduced down to nothing, they will follow it. They will do it.
It's funny, when they created the class of carbohydrates, they should have created two, a complex and a simple. Because when we're talking about the carbohydrates to cut out, you're talking about your potatoes and your rice and things that are ultimately sugar to your body.
That's right.
You're not talking about the greens that are low in starch, like your spinach and your kale and your parsley and your broccolis and things like that.
Yeah, well, they're very high in fibre. They're also going to contribute some sugar, so you've got to be very careful, and you balance it out by putting, like if you have a salad, for example, a green salad, you smother it in extra virgin first cold pressing olive oil, for example. But that's, yes, the fibre, the indigestible fibre is fine. In fact, it has a role to play in the large bowel.
Right, and that's ultimately your prebiotic that your biome's going to live on.
That's right. and it's converted to short-chain fatty acids, which makes your bowel much healthier, which also then, this is the basis of another program of mine, which is for things like kidney failure, because if you feed a high-fibre diet of healthy vegetables, not only and it's got to be totally put through a juicer, so you've got the juice and the fibre separated, then they both go into the diet. The juice contains all those phytonutrients, which are so brilliant for health, and many of which have anti-cancer and immune stimulating and health properties. But the fibre ends up in the large bowel. It feeds the bacteria down there. It's a prebiotic. They produce all these short-chain fatty acids on which they grow and on which the colon wall grows. And now we have a situation where the bacteria, which are growing, they've got all this energy in the form of short-chain fatty acids. They need some protein to produce their cells. Where do they get it from? They draw it out of the bloodstream.
Right.
And so the colon now becomes like a third kidney in terms of taking a load off the kidneys of the nitrogenous wastes. And this is the basis of the kidney diet and the basis of so many diets for older dogs and cats with degenerative diseases, where we feed them these crushed vegetables.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
How do you get a cat to eat a vegetable?
Well, in fact, well, for 15 years, I was producing a dog food and a cat food, and it was the dog food with its slightly higher levels of vegetable material that was very, very successful as our kidney diet for cats.
Oh, that's brilliant. Okay. See, so I sell lots of this stuff, right? So that's what I do. I'm a retailer. I don't manufacture any of the foods. No. I learn this stuff so that I can understand and help my customers choose the right things. But that's an interesting one, because I'd never heard that the dog stuff has anywhere between 5 and 15% vegetables, depending on the manufacturer. And
should have, in my opinion.
Yeah, and what level would be too much for a cat then?
Whatever it won't eat.
Oh, okay.
It is so absurdly simple, is it not?
Right. And it really does come down to, I did a video yesterday for my store. I do these little weekly videos for my store. And it was just keep it simple. Don't panic. Don't let anybody tell you don't know enough. It's just, exactly. And we give shirts away. They say, keep calm and feed raw.
Yes. Because the body, I've seen some atrocious raw diets. Like I've seen, there was well, no, what I'm thinking of is I'm thinking of a dear aunt of mine. She had this 18 or 19-year-old little white shaker, what was it? It was a Maltese. It was a Maltese. They get the shakers to say, so I tend to call them little white shakers. Anyway, it was 18 years old, and she hadn't fed it anything other than minced meat for the last 10 years. Nothing else. Now, I'm sure it ate its own poo.
Right.
It probably pinched something out of the garden. But it taught me that dogs, if they're fed raw food, and you cannot do that with a puppy, by the way, if anybody's listening, they'll get a calcium deficiency and it'll be atrocious. But with an adult dog, you do not need all that calcium. And
they're so resilient.
They're so resilient. And it obviously, whatever calcium was there, it managed to use to the nth degree, and dogs will do that. And that's why you can feed this one diet to dogs, by the way, which is high in calcium, because what they don't need, they poop out.
Yeah.
And if you look at the poop of a raw-fed dog that's on bones, what's it do? It turns white in the sun after a few days.
Yeah, small, firm, brown, and bumpy.
What's that?
That's what we described the ultimate poo to be to people. Small, firm, brown, and bumpy.
Well, it turns white, and then it just crumbles and goes away.
Yeah, because it's mostly bone.
And it's not offensive. Well, it's fairly offensive. It's still
poo.
But a lot of people have actually used that in compost heaps, and it's fine. But so anyway, I think the point there is that the raw diet is very resilient. You do, yes, relax. And Stop all those rules and stop. There are people on the internet, and I saw one the other day, and I won't make any names, of course, but this person was prescribing very specific amounts of nutrients that they had to include in this raw diet. And it was all based on AFCO principles. And I said, no, not necessary. Absolutely.
The AFCO standards don't make sense for fresh food.
They make no sense at all. They don't even make sense for those foods because most of them are guesses and guesstimates. And here's hoping because they just simply don't know. And what they don't know is the interactions.
So that leads me, what happened to your profession, the veterinarians? So from my perspective, I require good veterinary advice on occasion for my pets, my family members. I require a good doctor who can give me good advice on how to keep my animals as healthy as possible. Why is it occasionally I get shamed for feeding fresh foods?
Because that's the way they were taught. You have to appreciate that veterinarians a lot of veterinarians, well, in Australia, a lot of people are selected to go into the veterinary science faculty on the basis of their marks. So they're very bright people. Mm-hmm. A lot of them have never owned an animal in their life.
Because they see enough of them.
Well, I don't know. They've just never, or they've lived at home and mum's looked after the animals.
Right.
So then they go to veterinary school and they're taught all this science stuff. And it's very good for the most part. And then in the case of places like Sydney University, there's a major pet food company, and I'm not going to name it, comes in, and this major pet food company becomes their tutor, their lecturer, teaches them everything they need to know about companion animal nutrition. Part of that teaching is you must never, ever, ever, no matter what you do, feed raw food. It's dangerous. It will be unbalanced. It contains bugs that will kill the dogs. And if it's got bones in it, they will definitely pierce the bowel, cause peritonitis, and the dog will die. And I've seen vets who don't advocate raw, but they talk about it. Now, these people have been so brainwashed that they will tell lies. They will say, I see dozens every week of people feeding raw with gastrointestinal diseases. I see bowels perforated. I have to pull bones out of stomachs. I do all these operations. And I see the results of imbalanced diets, all these diseases of excess or deficiency. Mm-hmm. They're lying. They're telling porkies. But they do it because they feel they're doing their clients a service, because they've been told how dangerous those things are. And so people listen. This vet is a god as far as animal science and healing is concerned. Why would this person tell them anything other than the truth? Mm-hmm. And so this is a perception out there amongst people. And our vets honestly believe that fresh foods are bad. And they don't make that leap. Would I eat this way? Would I eschew fresh foods? Would I not eat salads? Or,
Well, balanced and complete makes no sense. Balanced and complete, when you think about it, is insane.
Well, it comes back to around about the 50s, but it also comes back to a commercial imperative. If you're going to sell food, a commercial food, the simplest way is to make each meal a complete meal in terms of nutritional balance and completeness.
That's that razor's edge we were talking about earlier.
That's right, and you can come close to that with real foods, and we did this with raw foods that we were selling for many years, and again the epidemiological evidence was absolutely brilliant. These animals were so healthy, and so many problems just cleared up just with this change in diet.
Obesity, diabetes, lower incidence of cancer. Like I see it in my store every day.
That's right. This is what happens. But the complete and balanced myth that every meal has to be complete and balanced arose in the 1950s. It arose at a time when when I think it was, well, the history tells me, and I'm getting this from somebody else, that it was Colgate-Palmolive who moved from using animal fats for their soap to using palm oil, basically.
Mm.
And so suddenly there was all this fat left around. What do we do with it?
You can't just throw it in the landfill.
Well, you know. And so let's make some money out of it. Now, the dentists were already in the hands of these people, and they said, we've got the dentists on board with toothpaste and all that sort of thing. Why don't we get the vets on board? They're already selling these biscuits, which are not complete. If we add fat to this and make sure there's minerals and vitamins added in, we can make a complete and balanced pet food. But what we have to do is get a sales force to sell it. And the most obvious sales force are the people in direct contact with the pet-owning public. That turns out to be veterinarians. So if we can sell to the veterinarians the idea that we're providing, or not only that we're providing this food, but every animal must have a complete and balanced diet at every meal, then suddenly we have got the perfect solution to selling our products, which are complete and balanced. And mind you, the complete and balanced changes every year and all that sort of thing. But putting all that aside, they had the perfect business model. And today, our vets have a brilliant business model because they can sell very high-end, expensive food that doesn't appear to cause a problem, but does cause a problem, that actually creates the patients, that brings them back, that then they, with a very bad degenerative disease, which is costly to diagnose, costly to treat, etc., etc. So what a brilliant business model where you create the disease for which you have the solution and which has professional and public approval. Wow.
Well, it's weird because I say to people who come into my store and they tell me what happened at the vet and why they're coming to me because they've lost faith, which is sad to see because they rely on that person for good medical advice. And then I say to them, well, what does your common sense say to you? Fresh food is better, or Nestle, or Mars, or, or Colgate? Like, which one's better? Those guys, the boxed foods, bagged foods, they last a year and a half on a shelf, or fresh foods? Your common sense, you tell me, which would you eat?
Of course. But unfortunately, the veterinary profession cannot see that. And they certainly can't see the benefit of real foods and homeostatic mechanisms despite their scientific training. It's
similar to the oncologists.
Eh?
Similar to the oncologists we were talking about earlier.
Well, they're even worse in many ways because they're brainwashed by the big pharma who is using them to sell their awful chemotherapies.
Right.
And radiation and all that. And it's such a science now.
It's tragic.
It's tragic. It is tragic. And if you ask an oncologist, does he expect to win? I think it would be a terrible profession or branch of the veterinary or medical profession to be in because you are just expecting constant failure.
Right.
It's awful. I couldn't do that kind of medicine. In fact, I remember walking out of a lecture way back in the 80s. There were some specialists from overseas, and they came in and they were talking about cancer, and the first lecture was about surgery, and they showed pictures of dogs with these terrible oral and facial tumours, and they just said, well, just cut it out. And then they showed pictures of dogs with the whole of their bottom jaw removed and the tongue drilling out.
What about quality of life?
And sorry?
Whatever happened to quality of life?
None whatsoever. Well, I walked out of that lecture. I thought, this is not the way I was brought to out, or wasn't my vision of being a veterinary surgeon or how to deal with this. And I was already seeing promise. I didn't know why in my own patients who were just fed a real food diet. They either were not getting it, or if they did get it, it was later in life, and we could actually cause it to regress by getting them off all of any processed food. Because a lot of people, they would feed fresh, but they say, oh, but I just feed a bit of dry food because it says on the packet it's got everything a dog needs.
Just in case.
So they're having a bet each way. So we took them off that, and we saw so many. And I didn't even know about the ketogenic diet then, but we saw so much improvement. And now, it's and look, so I do thank you for the opportunity to, in my bumbling way to spread this message. It is complex.
This book is amazing. This book here is absolutely phenomenal. Like it just, I gave it to my brother-in-law, who's a big health, nut, you could say, right? Great guy, dives super deep, and your book is just he immediately everything was being highlighted, and it was just awesome. Yeah, it's just a phenomenal book.
Well, I find that I have to write things down to understand them. And so in many ways, I think writers don't make good speakers, because when I write something, I have to rehash it about 6 times before I get it right.
Mm-hmm. And so just real quick, I know we're running short on time. The one other myth, or 2 other myths I wanted to cover today was, so they're kind of opposite each other. So I have trainers who come in who say they have this hyperactive dog and they want to put him on raw because it'll calm him down. And then I have other people who come in and say, I don't want to put my dog on raw because it'll make him vicious. Which is it?
It calms them down, most definitely. There's a whole group of trainers in Australia that will not train a dog unless you switch to raw. Nice. And this does not make them vicious. And in fact, in the history of mankind, I don't know whether it was Jared Dime, but it could have been one of those writers, or somewhere it's been documented that those peoples who are raised on a mainly carbohydrate diet are far more warlike and dangerous than people. And think of the Maasai. They're a very gentle people, and they live on blood and milk, animal products. Yeah, they milk the cows on both ends. That's right. Yeah. So no, the answer is the people who say, I want to calm my dog down. That is the way to go. Now, awesome. they'll be hyperactive, but they'll be happy hyperactive. Right. And not vicious. Because part of the problem with mental aberrations is, and I make this point all the time in lectures and what have you, if you want to produce your car to run properly, you put the right parts in it and the right fuel and the right oil. We do the same with our dogs. They run better, and that includes their brain. It's absolutely. Again, it's simplicity itself. Now, the biochemistry behind it is fairly complex, but you don't have to know any of that. Just feed food. Don't worry about nutrients. Exactly. And Dr. B, I think our time's up with you today, and I just wanted to say thank you. Deepest gratitude to you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I hope we've covered all the things you wanted to say. And if anybody, for those poor people who don't get the opportunity to win the book, where can they find it? Oh, just go to my website, www.drianbillinghurst.com. Yeah, so it's www.dr as in doctor. So it's drianbillinghurst.com. And look, and thank you for the opportunity to chat. I'm very happy to chat about these things. I'm just happy to talk about whatever comes up. Thank you for the opportunity. I thank you very much, sir. I'm just going to stop the recording here. And